The camera drifts over a silent reservoir, its gray surface like a mirror hiding something unspeakable. A single rusted curve breaks the stillness, yellow, familiar, wrong. In 1972, a school bus carrying 28 children vanished without a trace. For 40 years, the town searched, prayed, and waited. Then a drought lowered the waterline, and the lake finally gave up its secret. Brief flashes of black and white photos. Smiling children, the driver's cap. A map with a shortcut circled in red. It shimmered just below the surface, muted gold, bleeding through the murky water like a bruise beneath skin. The divers didn't see it at first. At 30 feet, visibility was a whisper. Sediment drifted in slow spirals, disturbed only by the beat of their fins and the hiss of regulated breath. It was supposed to be a routine check. A drought had pulled the water back, revealing secrets better left submerged. One diver, younger than the others, swam past it twice before realizing it wasn't just a rock shelf or a rusted-out pickup, the kind often dumped into lakes like this. It was the curve of something manufactured, something unnaturally bright for this depth, something that didn't belong. Before we descend deeper into the reservoir's haunting silence and trace the final path of 28 children and the man who drove them into history's shadows, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep lifting the veil on stories long submerged, the forgotten roads, the names carved only in grief, and the whispers trapped in waterlogged time. Every subscription helps keep these lost voices echoing just a little longer, so they're not swallowed again by silence. What you do here may seem small, but to the memories waiting in the dark, it means everything. Thank you for remembering with us. He turned, hovered, blinked. The light from his torch found a window, spider-webbed and yawning open. The shape was unmistakable, arched, familiar, and horrifying in its clarity. Yellow paint, peeled but present. School bus yellow. A name, half scratched out, lingered along the flank. The diver didn't move, not for a long time. His breath slowed. Somewhere above, birds might have been calling. But here, below, the world had forgotten how to make sound. When he surfaced, he didn't speak, just nodded, hands trembling as he pulled off his mask. The team gathered around, unsure whether to brace for bad news or a mistake. But the senior diver had already seen it in the boy's face. That look, the kind worn by those who touch something that was never meant to be found. They went back down, two at a time, keeping radio silence. Below, the silt seemed to pulse with memory. As they approached the wreck again, a slow truth unfolded before them. It sat like a carcass of something once warm. The windshield was long gone, its absence like a missing eye. The doors had collapsed inward, warped by time, by water, by pressure. One diver swept a gloved hand over the surface, revealing numbers painted decades ago, faint but still legible. He didn't need to say them aloud. The others recognized them. Everyone did. From posters, from newspaper clippings faded to gray. From the nightly news that, back then, couldn't explain how 28 children and one adult vanished without a trace. Until now. Inside, nature had rewritten the story. Algae clung to the seats like moss on gravestones. Wires dangled from the roof like skeletal vines. But beneath that, beneath years of decay, were smaller signs. A pair of rusted glasses on the floor. A child's sneaker, still white beneath layers of grime. Something like a stuffed animal, or what was left of it. The divers did not speak. There were no words for what hung in the water around them. 40 years of silence cracked open in an instant. They had not found just a vehicle. They had found a casket. Time had preserved it not out of mercy, but neglect. And now, surfaced by drought and chance, it offered itself to be seen, not understood. The news would come later, the headlines, the experts, the speculation. But down there, in the cold dark, it was quiet again. The reservoir held its breath, and the ghost yellow and waiting had finally come into view. February 9, 1972, began with the kind of gray that seeps into bone. The sky hung low over the valley, heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to rain or snow. In the pre-dawn hush, the only sounds were the creak of screen doors and the crunch of boots on frost-hardened dirt. Children emerged from clapboard houses, jackets unzipped, hair uncombed, sleep still clinging to their eyes. Some clutched lunch pails. Others dragged their feet, reluctant to face spelling tests or cafeteria meatloaf. But all of them paused when they saw the familiar shape rumbling down the road. The yellow school bus, dust-kissed, and humming with its usual growl, rounding the bend at precisely 7:03 a.m. It was a ritual, as ingrained as brushing teeth or saying grace. The driver, a widower named Walter Dorsey, tipped his cap as he pulled to a stop. He knew each child by name. He knew who needed the front seat because of motion sickness, who liked the windows open, no matter the temperature, who always saved a spot for their sibling. Walter didn't say much, but his silence was warm, like wool. The children trusted him. One by one, they boarded, some with laughter, others with sleepy nods. A girl in a blue coat twirled on the icy gravel before climbing the steps. A boy with a missing front tooth carried a comic book, eager to show it to his seatmate. The bus door sighed shut. The engine growled again, and the vehicle continued its route, winding through the back roads, scooping up more young faces from corners of the valley too quiet for morning cartoons. 28 children in all, some barely taller than the seats they slumped into. It was an ordinary day, ordinary in the way only hindsight makes unbearable. By 8 a.m., the school secretary noticed the bus hadn't arrived. She checked her watch. She called the depot. Nothing unusual had been reported. By 8:30, a teacher joked that the kids were probably staging a rebellion. By 9:15, the first parent called, voice tight. By noon, the laughter had died in the halls. All that remained was a gnawing hush. No one remembered hearing a crash. No tire marks, no debris, no witnesses. Just silence where there should have been sound. The valley swallowed the hours. When dusk arrived, it brought sirens. Search parties formed beneath headlights and flashlights, voices echoing across frozen fields. But there was nothing. No skid, no trail, no sign that a bus had ever passed. That morning would become a fracture in the town's timeline. A line drawn clean through memory, before the bus and after it. Parents would replay their goodbyes until they blurred into dreams. Did I say I loved you? Did I zip your coat? Did I look long enough? And on that road, where tire tracks once traced routine, frost settled again, undisturbed. The bus did not come back. Not that day. Not ever. The seats remained unfilled, the classrooms too quiet, and somewhere, out beyond the tree line and the questions, the road curved into shadow. A turn no one could trace. A path that stole the morning and never gave it back. The sun rose that day, but it felt like it didn't. Light spread across the valley without warmth, touching rooftops and thawing the frost on windows, but inside the houses, something remained frozen. In kitchens where cereal sat uneaten and eggs turned cold on plates, parents lingered by phones that didn't ring. The school bus was late by an hour, then two. Most assumed a breakdown, maybe a flat tire on the gravel-strewn shortcut near Mill Creek. But no one could reach Walter, and no one had seen the children. By mid-morning, anxiety soured into dread. Cars began to pull into the school parking lot. One by one, parents arrived, scanning the lot for the yellow bus that had once felt as reliable as the sunrise. Teachers stood in clusters, whispering too quietly, looking past one another. The principal, a man not prone to dramatics, locked his office and walked to the sheriff's department on foot. He didn't want to say the word missing. Not yet. By noon, the town had changed. It wasn't visible in the buildings or the roads, but in the way people moved slower, as if listening for something. Radios were turned up, doors left ajar. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder on porches, waiting for the sound of the engine, the hiss of brakes, the rattle of the door swinging open. It never came. At one house, a mother sat at the kitchen table, her daughter's backpack still resting beside her, untouched. She kept touching it. She said it felt warm, as if the girl had only just stepped away. As the sun dragged across the sky and began to sink, people stopped pretending. The sheriff's voice cracked as he made the first official statement on the courthouse steps. Search parties would be organized. Volunteers were needed. If anyone had seen the bus, anything at all, they should come forward. But no one had, not a soul. The woods, once places of summer adventure and innocent mischief, became suspects. Every trail, every ravine, every bridge was suddenly threatening. Men unfolded maps on kitchen tables, some yellowed and curling at the edges. They traced the bus's usual path with fingers smudged in ink and soil. Where could it have gone? How far could it travel without someone seeing? By twilight, theories swirled like dust in sunbeams. Some said Walter had snapped, driven the children into the hills. Others whispered about an old mine shaft, half collapsed, unmarked on modern maps. A few believed in something darker, something unspoken that had lived in the valley long before them, waiting. No one said those rumors aloud in the daylight, but they crept into conversations when the lights dimmed and the silence stretched too far. Dogs barked at nothing that night. Spotlights swept over treetops. Helicopters buzzed like insects above the frozen ground. But nothing answered. The road remained empty, and the yellow bus, so bright, so loud, so full of life, had simply dissolved into the landscape. In that stillness, the town didn't breathe. It held its breath. For a day, for a week, for decades. Something had gone missing, and not just the children. Time itself bent inward, paused at the point where tires should have left tracks but didn't. Where laughter should have echoed, but didn't. And in that hollow, the town waited, and waited, and waited. Walter Dorsey was the kind of man people forgot to notice until he was no longer there. In photographs, he always stood just behind the frame, half smiling, arms crossed, a cap pulled low over his brow. A man of habits, not spectacle. He had driven the school bus through the valley for nearly 17 years. No one else wanted the route. It was long, winding, rough in winter, but Walter didn't complain. He liked the quiet, liked the way the hills opened up when the fog lifted, liked the sound of the kids arguing about cartoons or spelling words or who got to sit by the window. He didn't need much more than that. Each morning, he woke at 5:30, whether or not the sun had. He drank his coffee in silence, sitting at a small wooden table stained with years of use. He left the radio off. He preferred the stillness. After putting on his uniform, a clean button-down, ironed the night before, he'd walk the short path to the depot, boots crunching on gravel. The bus, old and patched with age, would already be waiting. He checked it meticulously. Tires, brakes, headlights. The same checklist, every day, without fail. He took care of it like it was something living. Walter had no children of his own. His wife, Elaine, had passed a decade earlier, and they'd never managed to start a family. But the children on that bus became something close. He learned their rhythms. Knew who needed time to wake up and who came bounding on with energy to spare. He kept a jar of peppermints in the glove compartment for the ones who got carsick, and always carried a box of tissues tucked into the side pocket of his seat. On cold mornings, he'd let them wait inside the bus with the heater on, the engine running, even if it meant leaving early. When they filed out at school, he always watched until the last coat disappeared into the building. But even Walter had his superstitions. There was a bend in the road near Kersey Hollow that made him uneasy. Always had. It cut through an old patch of forest that had been partially cleared when they widened the road just a few years prior. The county had paved over it quickly, too quickly, some said. Locals noticed that stretch seemed to shift. Asphalt cracked in strange patterns. After a heavy rain, the shoulder would sometimes sag, like the ground beneath it was giving way. Walter had written it up in his maintenance log. Twice, no one had followed up. Still, he never swerved around it, never rushed. He'd slow the bus to a crawl there, especially when the weather turned. Some mornings, a thin mist would hang low over that section, turning the world gray. He'd grip the wheel tighter, keep his eyes forward, and when the tires reached the other side, he'd exhale, as if passing through something he didn't quite trust. That February morning was no different. He performed his checks, smiled as the children climbed aboard, nodded at a parent on their porch. When he turned the key, the engine sputtered, caught, and settled into its usual purr. He looked once in the rearview mirror. 28 young faces, some tired, some laughing. He put the bus in gear. The road stretched ahead, quiet and unbothered. Kersey Hollow waited just beyond the tree line, the curve obscured by a thin veil of morning fog. And Walter, faithful, careful, unshakable Walter, drove on, into the soft white silence that would never let him leave. They started with hope. That was the first thing to arrive, even before the sirens. Hope, brittle but determined, carried in on the boots of neighbors and friends who refused to believe that 29 people, 28 children, and one driver could simply vanish. Within hours of the sheriff's grim announcement, the town became a hive of motion. Men from the mill, women from the diners, teenagers skipping school with flashlights clutched in shaking hands. They came because it was unthinkable not to. The air that afternoon was sharp with cold, the sky a flat sheet of lead. Helicopters buzzed low over the valley like mechanical insects, beating back the silence. Their rotors stirred the tree canopy, bending pine and bare oak alike, searching for any unnatural disruption, a glint of metal, a smear of yellow, broken branches marking a descent. But from above, the forest looked undisturbed, timeless, as if it had swallowed something and stitched itself closed. On the ground, dogs were brought in from 3 counties. Bloodhounds trained on scraps of clothing, a scarf, a mitten, a gym shirt marked with a child's name in permanent ink. The dogs sniffed, howled, led handlers into thick woods only to circle back, confused. The trail, it seemed, went everywhere and nowhere at once. Snowmelt muddied the banks of the creeks. Footprints, if they had existed, were erased before they could be noticed. The sheriff coordinated the search like a battlefield campaign. Grid lines drawn over old topographic maps, checkpoints, radios, assignments. People were told to call out names softly, gently, as if the children were simply playing hide and seek and needed coaxing back. But the woods gave no answers. Each call was met with wind, each echo swallowed by branches. Some searchers reported the strange sensation of being watched. Others said the silence pressed in too tightly, as if the forest didn't like being disturbed. Days passed, then weeks. Helicopters were grounded. Search dogs went home. The number of volunteers dwindled, from hundreds to dozens, and then just a handful of family members and the broken-hearted who couldn't stop moving. The rivers were dragged, black water slapping against rowboats, hooks slicing through current. They pulled up old tires, fence posts, rusted oil drums, everything except what they were looking for. Local hunters scoured trails that didn't appear on any maps. An old man insisted he'd seen strange lights near the ridge the night before the disappearance. A teenage girl claimed she'd heard the bus pass her house an hour late, but she was known to lie. Tips poured in. Most were nonsense, all were dead ends. Eventually, the questions turned inward. People asked if Walter had snapped, if he had been drinking, if someone had forced him off the road. But theories were no substitute for answers. And as the weeks slipped into a kind of numb inertia, the forest remained untouched by explanation. By the end of the month, the official search was scaled back, resources exhausted, statements made, files stored in drawers that rarely reopened. What remained was quieter, harder to document. Parents driving the roads at dusk, scanning ditches with trembling flashlights. Children laying flowers at the empty school bus stop. A teacher who never erased the names from her roll call. The search had been loud, frantic, desperate. But now, what lingered was quieter, grief with no direction, questions with no place to rest. And somewhere, beneath trees older than memory, the truth waited without urgency. Unfound, unmoved, unwilling to be revealed. At first, the investigation clung to the obvious. The bus had a route, a routine. A set of turns it was meant to make, the same ones Walter Dorsey had driven every weekday for nearly 2 decades. That was the assumption, that the road had behaved, and so had Walter. That the route, so familiar it could be drawn from memory by half the town, had been followed like always. But as days turned to weeks and the expected paths yielded no answers, cracks formed not just in theories, but in the very ground beneath them. It began with a conversation. A retired delivery driver, sipping coffee at the gas station counter, mentioned a back road. He said it casually, more like a memory than a clue. Walter used to take it sometimes, he said, when weather turned or when time was tight. A narrow pass that cut across the hills south of the main highway, slicing the commute by 10 minutes. It wasn't on any official transport map. In fact, it had been decommissioned years before, labeled unstable after a landslide nearly swallowed a pickup truck back in '69. But locals still used it from time to time. Out of habit, out of stubbornness. The shortcut, as it was known in hushed tones, didn't show up on modern county records. But the older men remembered it. Wound through scrub and soft earth, tracing the rim of what had once been farmland and now bordered something much more precarious. The construction zone for the new dam. A towering concrete skeleton, still unfinished, its foundations dug deep into the landscape. By 1972, the structure was halfway built, and the river had already begun to swell behind its temporary walls. The valley beyond had started to change. Roads were rerouted. Old paths buried or blocked, but the shortcut remained for now. Investigators, desperate for alternatives, traced the whispered route. They found the starting point, hidden behind a curtain of trees and marked by a rusted road sign bent nearly in half. It was barely passable. Roots cracked through the pavement. One section had crumbled entirely, nothing but earth and slope, and a sharp drop into nothing. But it was wide enough for a bus, just barely. And it curved. Dangerous and steep, it curved hard toward the very edge of the reservoir basin, still dry at the time, still being carved by machines and reshaped by dynamite and steel. No one had thought to search there. It hadn't been part of the designated grid. It hadn't been part of the plan. And that, investigators realized with a sick weight in their chests, may have been the mistake. A theory began to take shape not because of evidence, but because of absence. If Walter had decided, for reasons no one would ever know, to take the shortcut that day, he would have passed within yards of a freshly dug ravine, one not yet marked with proper signage. Loose gravel, soft shoulders, a blind turn. All it would have taken was one miscalculation. One curve taken too fast. One soft patch of soil beneath heavy wheels. And then silence. They sent a team to survey the area. But by then, it was too late. The basin had been filled just months after the bus vanished. Water now sat 30 feet deep in the very place they suspected the road once ran. The shortcut was gone, swallowed. It was no longer a question of where the bus had gone. It was a question of what lay beneath. The mailboxes stayed full for a while. At first, it was flyers, bills, folded newspapers that no one had the strength to read. But there were also letters. Letters addressed to children who would never read them. A grandfather in Pennsylvania who didn't know yet. A cousin in California who always wrote in crayon. Cards with glitter still clinging to the inside, wishing someone a happy birthday that would never come. The mailman delivered them all, solemn and wordless, a man who knew not to ask questions anymore. Eventually, the letters stopped arriving. The names faded from envelopes, and silence began to take their place. Inside the homes that had once burst with noise, something else settled in a quiet that wasn't peace. A stillness made of waiting. Coats remained on hooks far too small for anyone grown. Beds were left made, exactly as they'd been the morning of February 9th, some with stuffed animals still arranged along the edge. Others with worn blankets folded neatly, waiting to be pulled back just one more time. A model of the solar system with planets dangling from string, coated in glitter and glue. The dust on it thickened year after year, as if time were preserving the child's last ambition. Parents grieved in different ways. Some refused to speak their child's name out loud, as though doing so might rupture the fragile shell of their denial. Others spoke as if their son or daughter were still alive, just out of sight at camp, at a cousin's house, at school, running late. One mother, Ruth Callahan, set a plate at the dinner table every evening. Always in the same spot, across from where she Saturday. She did it out of habit at first, then out of principle. 40 years. 40 years of second helpings uneaten. Of glasses filled with water that no one touched. Her daughter, Mary Ann, had been 8. She had wanted a telescope for her birthday. It arrived in the mail a week after the bus disappeared. Ruth never opened the box. Some families moved away, thinking distance might loosen grief's grip, but even across state lines, the absence followed. Other parents stayed, frozen in the geography of loss. The town was still their prison, but also their shrine. At every school function, at every Sunday Mass, their eyes flickered to empty spaces. They spoke quietly, if at all. They aged faster. The town's children, those too young to remember, or those not on the bus that day, grew up in the shadow of that hole. They learned early not to ask too many questions, but they could feel it, in the way their parents grew quiet at sunset, in the way teachers looked away when a class list didn't add up, in the way the lake was never quite treated like a place for swimming. Time passed, but it didn't heal. It only changed the shape of the wound. Every year, on the anniversary, flowers appeared at the old bus stop, dried-out bouquets, handwritten notes left in plastic to guard against rain. A few reporters returned for interviews, but most were turned away. The families had learned that some stories were not for spectacle. Some grief was too old, too sacred, to be packaged and explained. But the absence no camera could capture that. No newspaper could print the way it sat inside people, pressed like a stone beneath the ribs. It lingered in the clink of an untouched fork, in a birthday cake never sliced, in the last letter a mother wrote and never mailed, a letter that simply said, "Come home, I'm still waiting." In the spring of 1973, the valley took its last breath. The dam, once just a concrete promise etched into blueprints, was now a towering wall of poured stone and rebar, stretching like a scar across the edge of town. The project, hailed by the state as a marvel of engineering and a future lifeline during dry seasons, came with little ceremony but irreversible consequence. The workers, tangent-faced and tired, packed up their machines. Bulldozers stilled, cranes lowered their heads, and with the turn of a rusted wheel, the floodgates opened. At first, it came as a trickle, water whispering into the lowest parts of the valley, grass bent under its weight. Dust turned to mud. The creek, once meandering and modest, grew into a wide mouth that swallowed everything below. Trees fell slowly, their roots gasping for something solid. The air changed, heavy with the scent of drowning earth. It wasn't fast. It took days, then weeks, but the end was certain. Families came to watch, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't stay away. They stood at the ridges and hillsides, clutching binoculars, squinting down into the bowl of the valley as it filled like a grave. They pointed out landmarks as they vanished. There was the fence post, where the Thompson kids carved their names. There the foundation of an old barn that once held dances. And just beyond that, the shortcut. The shortcut was among the first things to go. The forgotten road, unofficial and unloved, had already been damaged by time and erosion. But its path was still visible, a winding scar across the hillside, traced faintly by gravel and memory. It led downward, toward a ravine that had become increasingly unstable since the blasting began. Locals said it had shifted during the first winter freeze. Others believed it had been dangerous long before. That it had always known how to give way. When the water reached the ravine, it filled it slowly, curling into the hollow like ink dropped into a well. No one spoke as it happened. There was no need. Those who stood watching remembered. The maps, the theories, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this was the place where the yellow bus had gone. That maybe beneath the surface, obscured by silt and stone, something still waited. But no proof was ever found, and the flood did not pause for grief. It continued its crawl, covering acre after acre. Trees disappeared, then fence lines, then dirt roads and forgotten trails. Eventually, even the foundation stones of an old church were consumed, its bell tower long since removed, but its bones left behind, all of it erased. By summer's end, the lake was full, a perfect sheet of steel-gray water reflecting the sky. On maps, it was given a name, Crescent Reservoir, but most locals just called it the flood. Fishermen cast their lines from aluminum boats, children skipped rocks along the edges. A man-made paradise, some said. But beneath that still surface, time remained trapped. The past hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been buried under 30 feet of silence. People forgot how the land had once curved. The shape of the roads, the tilt of the ravine, the way shadows fell across the shortcut at dusk, lost beneath layers of water and distance. The new lake glistened, offering recreation, irrigation, a future. But for those who remembered, it also offered something else. A quiet terror. The knowledge that the truth might be down there, intact, undisturbed, sealed in silt and memory, not gone, just hidden. There are photographs, old and curling at the corners, kept in shoeboxes and brittle albums in attics no one visits anymore. Black and white shots taken on sunlit days when nothing seemed fragile. Children running through tall grass, arms outstretched like wings. A rusted swing set creaking with the wind, its shadow stretching across cracked earth. A farmhouse in the distance, white paint peeling, clotheslines strung with sheets like sails in a quiet sea of pasture. There was laughter in those frames, the kind that didn't know it would be remembered. One photo, taken just a year before the disappearance, shows the ravine dry, steep, and raw. A narrow road winds beside it, a shortcut barely clinging to the edge. Two boys on bicycles pose at the curve, unaware of the soft soil beneath their tires. The camera had caught them mid-laugh, their shirts untucked, their futures intact. Below that very bend, now submerged, water pulses silently over what was once the last turn anyone remembered. Decades later, the valley tells a different story. Drone footage taken by environmental researchers shows a mirror of water stretching for miles, bordered by pines and brush that have forgotten the land they replaced. The surface glints silver beneath the sun, calm and glassy, no hint of what lies beneath. You wouldn't know a town had once breathed there. You wouldn't know that 28 children and one man had vanished into its soil. Beneath the water, fish drift through shadows where schoolyards once echoed. Bass nest in the hollow where a general store once stood, the shelves long gone, the air replaced with silt and silence. Weeds sway like ghostly fingers over what was once the shortcut road, now no more than a memory etched into the contours of the lakebed. Time moves differently here. It doesn't tick forward, it hovers. Scientists surveying the sediment speak in detached tones, noting mineral levels and depth, never realizing the ground they measure once held secrets the world forgot. There's no plaque beneath the surface. No marker, no cross. Just decay and waiting. And yet, somehow, the valley has kept its story. Not told it, just held it, quietly, unmoving. The parents who stayed rarely speak of the reservoir. Some drive past it without looking. Others sit at its edge in silence, tracing the waterline with tired eyes, as if hoping it might recede and give something back. A few have tried to swim out into its center, but none have stayed long. The water is colder than expected. Heavier, somehow, as if it carries more than it should. What drones see from above, what cameras capture from the air, is beauty. A flawless body of water bordered by serenity. But that beauty is a skin stretched over bone. A calm surface that hides everything time tried to forget. Underneath, there are no words. Only objects, slowly decaying. Metal rusting, cloth unraveling. Maybe even bones, long settled into the mud, too delicate to disturb. Maybe the shape of a steering wheel, a row of bus seats, a shoe with a name written inside. Maybe nothing at all but silence. The valley once had sound birdsong, wind in the grass, the high-pitched joy of recess. Now it has only echo, dampened by water and time. Where children once laughed, fish now swim. And the stillness above tells only half the story. The rest lies buried, too deep to reach but too present to ignore. In the summer of 2012, the lake gave something back. It wasn't a choice, not exactly. Nature had been pushed too far, too long. A drought swept through the region, relentless and dry-mouthed. Crops withered, wells ran shallow. And Crescent Reservoir, once placid and full, began to shrink like a breath drawn inward and never released. The shoreline receded by feet, then yards. Boat docks sat suspended above cracked mud. Fish flopped in shallow pools. A reservoir built to swallow a valley was now showing its ribs. The sheriff's department in the next county over took the opportunity to organize a cleanup dive. For years, rumors had clung to the reservoir like algae joyrides gone wrong, cars dumped in the dark, insurance fraud left to rust beneath 30 feet of water. Divers were dispatched to sweep through exposed areas, dragging sonar equipment behind them, expecting to find old wrecks and empty shells of forgotten machines. What they found instead stopped them cold. It was the third day of diving. The heat above was brutal, but below, the water remained thick and cold, heavy with silt and age. Visibility was poor just a few feet in front of the mask. The team moved slowly, feeling more than seeing. The diver at point, a man named Jacob Mercer, swept his gloved hand through the darkness, expecting to brush metal or weeds. Instead, his hand struck a curve. At first, he thought it was a tree limb. But as he steadied himself and cleared the sediment, a strange outline emerged. A smooth, rounded frame. Edges corroded, but unmistakably manufactured. The color was barely there, but it was there yellow, faint, dulled by years underwater, but still yellow. Jacob hovered there, heart pounding against his suit. He radioed the surface, his voice calm, but his hand shook as he pressed the transmitter. Together, they swept back more layers of mud and debris. A window appeared, then another, bent, cracked, but still intact. When they swam to the side, they found a door, still hinged, slightly ajar. And then something floated out. It was small. Fabric. A child's backpack, its zipper rusted shut, the pattern too faded to make out. It drifted upward for a second, then sank again, as if even now the lake did not want to let it go. That's when Jacob noticed the glove, his own gripping the frame of the window too tightly. But something about the shape in front of him made him freeze. A faint indentation, visible inside the bus. He aimed his flashlight. The beam cut through the murk and revealed a seatbelt still buckled. And beside it, something pale. He didn't stay long after that. Neither did the others. When they emerged, the air felt thin, too hot, too loud. Jacob removed his gloves slowly. His hands were trembling. He wouldn't speak for hours. The lake was cordoned off. Authorities arrived quietly. No press, no statements. Not yet. What lay beneath the water wasn't just evidence. It was a grave. A sealed pocket of history that had waited 40 years to be seen again. And all it had taken was time, and thirst, and a diver's gloved hand brushing against memory. It emerged from the murk like a ghost. At first, only fragments revealed themselves, a curve of metal here, a darkened window frame there, until the diver's beams joined to sketch the full shape. A bus. An entire school bus resting on its side, half buried in the bed of the drained reservoir. It had become part of the landscape, encased in layers of silt and time, its bright yellow skin muted to the color of old paper. Along its sides, faded letters whispered a name that had once been clear and proud. A number 2, still faintly visible, one that every person in the town would recognize from a flyer printed 4 decades earlier. The windows had not survived. They were jagged holes now, shattered long ago by pressure, by current, by whatever unseen force had brought the bus here. Weeds and algae wove through the openings, creeping over the seats like green ghosts. Rusted springs protruded from the cushions, curling like brittle vines. The air inside, once filled with chatter and the squeal of brakes, was now water and silence. A silence so complete it felt heavy, pressing in on the divers' ears through their masks. Even their breathing seemed muffled, distant, as though the bus itself had swallowed sound. They swam carefully along the aisle, their gloved hands brushing the edges of seats that had held children who never came home. A pencil floated by, brittle and splintered. Near the back, a lunchbox lay upside down, its paint eaten away until only a faint outline of a cartoon character remained. It might have been red once, or blue, or something else entirely. It didn't matter now. Time had taken color from everything. At first, they thought the bus was empty. It looked empty. The water had stripped it bare, scouring out every loose object, every trace of life. But then one diver's light settled on something pale beneath a seat. It was small, fragile, curved. He reached for it slowly, hand trembling. When he lifted it into the beam of his torch, the shape resolved itself with a quiet certainty. A bone. Not an animal bone too delicate, too human. A child's rib. Another diver found a skull, no bigger than a grapefruit, its eye sockets dark and unblinking. Then more tiny fragments lodged in corners, caught in the folds of fabric that had once been seat upholstery. The bus was not empty at all. It had been a tomb all along. They collected what they could with reverence, their movements slow and deliberate. Bags were filled and sealed, coordinates marked. No one spoke. Not through their radios, not when they surfaced. The water around them rippled once, then stilled again, as though closing itself over the secret it had held for 40 years. On shore, the air was hot and dry, but the divers shivered. The sheriff stood waiting, no press, no cameras. Just a few men who had grown up with the missing children's faces pinned to their refrigerator doors, now watching as the past surfaced piece by piece in plastic evidence bags. Faded paint, shattered windows, bones small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The silence of the bus lingered even after they left the water, clinging to them like a smell they couldn't wash off. It wasn't just discovery. It was confirmation of something the town had known but never allowed itself to speak. The bus had never left. It had only been waiting. The recovery of the bus was only the beginning. What came next unfolded, not under water but under harsh fluorescent lights, in laboratories and evidence rooms where time and science collided. The fragments brought up from the reservoir, bones small enough to be cradled in a single palm, Scraps of fabric, rusted trinkets were sealed in numbered bags, each one tagged with a date, a location, and a grim weight. They were transported quietly, without ceremony, because no ceremony could fit what they represented. In sterile rooms where air smelled faintly of antiseptic, technicians in gloves and masks began the work of untangling decades of silence. DNA testing had come far since 1972. Back then, it had barely existed. Now it was a net capable of catching whispers from the past. Scientists worked slowly, carefully. The remains were fragile, some no more than splinters, some still carrying traces of tissue preserved by cold silt and low oxygen. Each sample was catalogued, extracted, compared against a database built from the saliva and blood of aging parents and siblings, people who had volunteered their own genetic markers years earlier when hope had still flickered. Files long thought closed were reopened, their pages brittle, their photographs fading to sepia. Missing persons reports were scanned again, cross-referenced with dental charts and medical records older than some of the technicians themselves. Weeks passed, then names began to surface. Quietly at first, like faint voices coming through a wall. A match here, a partial match there, a jawbone belonging to a boy who had loved comic books, a femur that fit a girl who had wanted a telescope for her birthday. The state sent counselors to sit with the scientists, because the weight of the work was not only technical. Each name wasn't just an entry on a list. It was a life folded back into a town's history. The echoes were finally being identified. Families were notified one by one, not with headlines or broadcasts, but with phone calls or in-person visits by officers who had been children themselves when the bus disappeared. They carried manila envelopes and spoke softly. Some mothers collapsed before the words were finished. Some fathers sat perfectly still, staring past the officers as if they could see a long road stretching into fog. One grandmother pressed a photograph to her chest and whispered, "I knew it. I always knew." It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even closure. It was something rawer, like air hitting a wound. Not every family reacted the same way. Some wept. Some refused to believe it, even with evidence in hand. Some asked to see the remains, though most chose not to. For a few, the news landed like a stone in water, creating ripples of anger rather than relief. Why had it taken so long? Why had no one checked the valley before it was flooded? The questions sharpened, but the answers stayed dull. The town changed again, subtly. People who had avoided eye contact for decades began to nod at one another in the grocery store. Flags flew at half-mast without being asked. At the old bus stop, flowers appeared not in anonymous piles but in neat rows, each with a name, 28 names. And one for the driver, Walter, who had been the children's guardian on that last journey. For 40 years, the valley had held its silence. Now, slowly, the silence was being given shape. The echoes were no longer just rumors. They were children, finally named, finally found. The discovery reignited not only grief but fury. Not the kind that explodes in the streets, but the slow-burning anger that coils in quiet rooms, passed between old friends with hollow eyes. In the weeks after the bus was pulled from the lake's decaying grip, the town no longer whispered, it began to ask, loudly. In living rooms and church basements, in city council meetings and late-night phone calls, the shock had ebbed, but the questions had just begun to rise. Not the supernatural ones, not the what-ifs or the whys whispered to the dark, but the brutal, human questions. The kind with names and signatures attached. The kind with blame. How did no one see it? That was the first question. And it echoed. It wasn't rhetorical. The valley had been combed, they'd said. Dozens of men had walked its woods. Dogs had sniffed every mile. Helicopters had hovered. Search parties had stomped through thickets and creek beds. And yet, somehow, the bus had lain just beneath their feet, invisible. Hiding in a ravine that had been mentioned, once or twice, and then dismissed. The shortcut had never been officially marked, but everyone knew about it. Farmers used it. Delivery trucks took it. Walter had likely taken it too. A straight line that curved dangerously close to the construction site. So why hadn't the site been searched again before the water rose? Maps were produced, curled at the corners and yellowed with age. On some, the ravine appeared clearly a dip in the topography, leading into what would soon become the reservoir's deepest point. On others, especially those used in the final weeks of the 1972 search, the area was marked cleared. A red stamp, slanted and final. But no one remembered who had stamped it. No one recalled who had walked that stretch and decided it was safe to ignore. Bureaucracy, it turned out, had a long memory but a short conscience. Attention turned to the construction records of the dam. Permits were revisited, signatures re-examined. A few names emerged, some long since retired, others dead. One belonged to a project supervisor who had signed off on the final basin fill despite open requests for one more pass through the southern edge. Too costly, his notes read. No supporting evidence of relevance. Another belonged to a county engineer who had raised concern about the ravine's erosion, warning that if anything had gone off the road there, it would not be visible from above. His memo had never been answered. And then came the hardest question of all: why wasn't the flooding delayed? The timing had been tight. Federal funds, state deadlines, construction companies with profit margins and public timelines. The water had to rise. The town was told to move on. Officials, eager to forget, allowed the lake to bury the uncertainty. Closure by submersion. Now those decisions resurfaced like the bones they tried to hide. People demanded answers, but the people responsible had long since walked away, their guilt diluted by time or protected by red tape. Investigations were suggested, committees formed. But behind closed doors, everyone knew what it meant. The mistake had already been made. No punishment would undo it. What remained was shame. Collective. Heavy. A shared burden among those who had trusted the process, believed the experts, and silenced the doubts. The children had waited in the dark while the world moved on above them. Their names had faded from lips and lists, and when the water came, it sealed the truth in silence until the lake, parched and thinning, gave it back. The question was never just what had been missed, it was who had chosen not to look. He hadn't planned to say anything. For years, he had told himself it wasn't his place. He wasn't a detective, not a decision maker, just an engineer. A man with a clipboard and a schedule, hired to ensure that the walls held and the water flowed where it was supposed to. But when the story of the bus broke, when the lake finally loosened its hold and the yellow curve surfaced on the news, something in him cracked. The headlines, the photographs, the quiet weeping of names read aloud on the local station. He recognized one of them. A girl who had given him a daisy once, while he'd been surveying the slope near the old ravine. She couldn't have been older than 10. His name was Henry Lang. Retired now, gray and stooped, but with a mind still sharp and a memory that held details like thumbtacks in cork. In 1973, he had been a junior field engineer for the state. 29 years old, hungry to prove himself, buried in topography reports and soil data. He remembered the day the final inspection came. It was hot, the kind of heat that makes even rocks sweat. The last walkthrough before the basin was filled. He had been tasked with documenting the structural integrity of the western rim, the area closest to what locals called the shortcut. Henry had asked questions. It was his job to. He noted the ravine's steepness, the fresh erosion, the way the new road cut dangerously close to the edge. And then, he'd ask something else. Something that had lingered ever since. Wasn't this the area where the kids went missing last year? He remembered the silence that followed. Not a pause for thought, but a silence that felt deliberate, practiced. The supervisor, a man named Gilbert, long since dead, hadn't even looked up from his papers. "Let the past go," he'd muttered, as if swatting away a fly. "That's not our concern." Henry hadn't argued. He'd nodded, scribbled something into his notebook, and walked away. The checklist needed to be completed. The site had to be signed off. Delay wasn't an option. He remembered standing on the overlook later that afternoon, watching the first rivulets of water crawl down into the dry bowl below. Watching as the earth darkened and drank. He had kept his gloves on all day, except one. He always removed the left habit from his drafting days. The sun had burned the skin there slightly. A pink reminder that he had been present when the past was buried. For 40 years, he said nothing. But now, seeing the bones lifted from the silt, the names in the paper, he could no longer remain part of the silence. He called the sheriff's office. Left a message. They called him back within the hour. In his small living room, with the curtains drawn, he spoke. He described the meeting, the ignored concern, the casual dismissal. He produced an old box from his closet inside, water-damaged blueprints, field reports, a single glove still stained with earth. Evidence not of guilt, but of proximity, of having stood on the edge of knowing and been told to look away. "I didn't know they were right there," he said. "But I knew we hadn't looked, not really." No charges were filed. There was no criminal negligence that could be proved after 4 decades. But his testimony was recorded, his reports scanned into the new case file. The families listened. Some thanked him, some couldn't bear to hear it. Henry Lang returned to his quiet life. But the echo of those words, "Let the past go," stayed with him. Now, he knew, the past never goes. It waits, under layers of water and silence, until someone finally listens. They found it on the second sweep, when forensic divers were sent back to comb the interior of the bus seat by seat, inch by inch. Most of the artifacts recovered were as expected. Textbooks turned to pulp, bits of rusted zippers, buckles half buried in sediment, and scattered marbles that had settled like little glass eyes on the floor. But there was one item missed the first time. Something wedged between the side panel and the back of a seat near the rear of the bus. A child's backpack, mostly intact, its canvas thickened and hardened by decades underwater. It took nearly an hour to coax it free without destroying it. It wasn't supposed to hold anything more than fragments of the ordinary, but tucked in the front pocket, behind the bloated remains of a notebook and a pack of chewing gum turned to sludge, there was a scrap of paper. Folded, pressed, written on. It was a note. The ink had bled and bloomed, the way old writing does when drowned and preserved by time. But it hadn't vanished completely. It was still there, faint, shaky, scrawled in a child's unsteady hand. Experts would later enhance the image with digital overlays and light filters, but even before the technology filled in the gaps, everyone who saw it could read the words. "The road is gone." Just 5 words, no name, no date, no explanation. But it cleaved through the investigation like a blade. The forensic team passed it to the sheriff's office. The sheriff passed it to the families. And the families held it with trembling fingers, staring not just at the message but at what it implied, that one of the children on that bus had known something was wrong, had seen it, had felt it, had reached for pencil and paper not to pass time, not to scribble a drawing or a joke, but to say something real, something urgent, something final. The note offered no direction. Was it a message to the driver? A fragment of a larger sentence? A diary entry cut short? No one could say. But it whispered of panic, of realization, of a moment when routine gave way to fear. Perhaps the road, freshly paved and still soft in sections, had collapsed beneath them. Perhaps fog had swallowed the curve, and the edge came too soon. Or maybe the road itself had eroded days earlier, leaving only a path that looked solid from a distance and gave way when touched. Whatever the truth, The note told the one story no one had yet dared to imagine, that the children had not vanished all at once, that at least one of them had time to write. The handwriting was never matched. Too many samples lost to time, too many children gone. But a few mothers recognized the rounded loops. A teacher said it looked like something written by a fourth grader. No one knew for certain. And in that uncertainty, the note became something more than evidence. It became a voice. Small, brave, trapped in the dark. The road is gone. A simple statement, a devastating one. It didn't answer questions, it deepened them. It didn't blame or accuse. It merely told the truth, in the quiet way that only children can. The note was placed in a sealed case, and stored with the rest of the recovered artifacts. Not hidden, not displayed, preserved. Its ink, though faded, now carried the weight of memory, of loss, and of a final attempt to be heard. No one knows how long it lay there in that backpack, curled and waiting, but when it finally surfaced, it reminded the world that the past doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. They didn't all come at once. The names were released gradually, in careful batches. Each one confirmed only after the science was certain, and the next of kin had been contacted. Some were matched through old dental records, others through DNA samples donated by aging parents decades ago, stored in state databases on the slim chance of a day like this. But no one expected the weight those names would carry, not after so long, not after silence had settled so deeply over the town like a second skin. Each name returned like a heartbeat. First, Daniel Whitmore, age 9. Then Ava Linney, 10. Followed by Mason Carter, 7 years old. The list went on. 28 children, once spoken of only in past tense and in fragments, now called back into the light by letters on paper, etched into granite, whispered on lips that hadn't said them aloud in decades. For some parents, it was the first time they'd heard their child's name said by someone outside their home in over 40 years. It didn't bring peace, but it did bring something else: weight, gravity, a recentering of the truth. These weren't just the missing, they were people, children. And now they had their names again. Photographs surfaced. Worn school portraits, Polaroids yellowed with time, tucked into drawers and wallets. In them, the children smiled in awkward innocence. Toothless grins, bowl cuts, hair ribbons. One boy squinted at the sun, mid-laugh. One girl wore a dress sewn by her grandmother, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if she already knew the world could slip away. These faces, once only memories traded quietly between neighbors, began to take their place in the open. First in the paper, then on bulletin boards at the town library, then finally, in stone. The memorial wasn't large, that was intentional. It was never meant to be a spectacle. Just a place where names could live, carved into a slab of gray granite set by the edge of Crescent Reservoir, where the tree line gives way to water. The families chose the location. It faced the still lake directly, as if watching it, not accusing, but remembering. A flat expanse of water beneath a wide sky, quiet except for the wind. Each name was carved in the same size, the same typeface. No titles, no hierarchies, just the names, one after another, in a slow, solemn arc across the stone's face. And beneath them, etched into the base, a single sentence chosen by the families. Gone from the road, not from our hearts. On the day of the unveiling, there were no speeches, only presence. People stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, hands in pockets, eyes lowered. Some wept, some brought flowers, others simply stood. Children who had grown up hearing the story from behind closed doors now read the names aloud to their own kids, tracing the grooves with fingers that trembled slightly. And as the sun dipped low, casting the reservoir in hues of amber and ash, the names remained, unmoving, undeniable. After 40 years adrift in silence and sediment, they had returned not just to paper, not just to memory, but to stone, solid, permanent, a reminder that they had lived, that they had been loved, and that they would not be forgotten again. It didn't happen all at once. Healing never does. But in the weeks after the final name was carved into the stone by the reservoir, something subtle began to change in the town. You could hear it, not in grand declarations or sudden laughter, but in the soft sounds that returned like shy animals after a long storm. Screen doors creaked open in the mornings again. Porch lights, long left off, flickered back to life. Wind chimes, once silenced by grief, sang again in the late afternoon breeze. The town, once frozen in a moment it never understood, began to breathe. For years, life had been lived in half measures. Windows were cleaned, but curtains stayed drawn. Grass was cut, but gardens were left bare. The school had painted over the murals that once included the missing children's handprints. Families moved through daily routines as though time were suspended, as though too much joy might be mistaken for forgetting. But now, something had shifted. Not a forgetting, not even a forgiving, just a quiet release. As though the town had been holding its breath for 40 years and could finally let it go. Flags flew at half-mast for a week, not by order but by instinct. No one needed to be told. It just felt right. The barber placed an old photograph of the kids' baseball team in his front window. The librarian cleared a corner shelf and filled it with poetry, grief memoirs, and children's books about loss and memory. Not for tourists. For the people who had stayed, for those who had waited. Some families, for the first time, allowed themselves to speak, to share stories not only about the disappearance, but about the lives that had come before it. Little moments. A favorite bedtime song. The way a child would sneak the family dog into their room. A teacher remembered a note one girl had written on the back of a spelling test. "I like your smile." These memories had been buried too, under guilt and silence. Now they rose again, tentative but bright. There were still tears, still sleepless nights, still the hollow places at dinner tables and in photo albums. But there was movement now, a different kind of stillness. Not the frozen ache of unresolved questions, but the heavy calm that follows an answer, one that doesn't ease the pain but at least gives it shape. Closure, some said. Though most resisted the word. Closure sounded too clean, too complete. This was something messier, truer. A wound that would never fully heal, but at least no longer festered in the dark. The school organized a memorial event, modest and open to anyone. They didn't call it a service, just a gathering. Children recited the names. Bells were rung, one for each child, one for the driver. There were no speeches, no sermons, just presence and silence. The good kind. The kind that listens. By fall, the leaves had begun to turn again, as they always did. But this year, they seemed to do so without the weight of unfinished stories. Parents walked their children to the bus stop and waved without hesitation. The buses still groaned and hissed and smelled of vinyl and rust, but they no longer felt haunted. Just normal, just part of the day. Grief remained, it always would. But now, it had room to breathe. Room to stretch out and settle into the town's rhythm without suffocating it. The past hadn't been erased, it had been acknowledged, faced. And in doing so, the people of the town, those who had waited, those who had stayed, and those who had inherited the silence, had finally found a way to move forward. Not away, just forward. The lake looks peaceful now. Smooth, unbroken, a pane of dull silver stretching across the valley where once there were roads, homes, laughter, loss. On certain mornings, when the fog hangs low and the wind forgets to move, the surface becomes almost mirror-like, blank and deceptive, reflecting only sky. It offers nothing of what lies beneath. No clues, no shapes, just stillness. Crescent Reservoir has become a place of contradictions. It draws fishermen and joggers, families with picnic baskets, and children who skip stones without knowing what sleeps beneath their feet. It is a body of water, yes, But it is also a grave, a storybook, a silence that hums when you listen closely enough. Some swear they've heard it the way the water shifts strangely near the middle, the way sound carries differently there, as though the lake breathes in long, slow sighs. The bus is gone now, removed carefully from its tomb of sediment and water. What could be salvaged was restored. It sits under glass in a small county museum 2 towns over, surrounded by placards and photographs, memorials and timelines. People visit it with reverence, with sadness, with disbelief. Its paint has been scrubbed, its windows refitted. But no amount of restoration can make it whole. Inside, the seats are still rusted. Time left its fingerprints too deeply to erase. Children pass by it in school tours, wide-eyed and quiet. Some reach out to touch the glass. Their teachers speak in low voices, as if raising them might awaken something. Most don't stay long. The air around the bus carries a different kind of weight, one that seems to press into your chest. It isn't just history behind that glass, it's the echo of absence, the sudden drop of a laugh that never returned, the long, steady silence of 40 years. And yet, the lake still holds more. Divers will tell you there are other shapes down there, other relics caught in the clay and root systems, not all of them explainable. Old farm equipment, shards of broken bottles. Sometimes, the outline of a foundation stone from a house once filled with life, now reduced to ruin. Every so often, something else floats up. A toy, a scrap of fabric, a fragment of what used to be. The sheriff's department logs it, stores it, but doesn't always share it. Some things are too fragmented to make sense of. No one talks much about what else might be resting at the bottom. The official story ends with the bus, with the names carved into stone, with the museum exhibit bathed in soft lighting. But those who live nearby know better. They know that the surface lies, that the water is not empty, that stories sink deeper than memory and often stay there. The past does not evaporate. It waits. And sometimes, when drought or time or chance cuts through just enough of the stillness, it returns wet, rusted, ruined, but still breathing with the shape of what once was. Because the surface never forgets. It only waits.